Well, welcome to the Rest Is Politics Awards with me, Alastair Campbell.
And me, Rory Stewart. And this, I'm going to, Alastair, give you a bit of credit for this, the awards. So I'm going to be guided by you a little bit through the system.
So what we've done, Rory, we've just worked out a few categories, and each of us have to pick a person, an event, whatever it might be, to fit these categories: outstanding politicians, event of the year, surprise of the year, moment of the year, film of the year, all sorts of things.
Is it all about the World Cup, or are there some other stuff?
I'm going to try and get through it without even mentioning the World Cup.
Oh,
because unlike you, I'm just not obsessed with football. I'm just not a massive football fan like you. And then at the end, we're going to have a Lifetime Achievement Award. But on that one, we have to agree. On all the others, we don't have to agree. We can say what we like. So the first one is Outstanding British Politician of the Year.
Gosh. Well, as a starter for 10 then, maybe the big theme of the end of the year is the way in which we have moved a little bit away, I guess, from the extremes of populism of Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. And in their different ways, Keir Starmer and the Labour Party has, I think, completed the transition away from Jeremy Corbyn, made them a really serious electable party. You know, many, many points ahead. I know what they are, 20, 30 points ahead in the polls at the moment. And Rishi Sunak has, for all the grumbles we've done on the show, definitely, compared to Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, brought a bit more sort of sanity and restraint back to the Conservative Party. So
in your classic establishment way, Rory, you're going for the leaders. You go for the two leaders of the two main parties. I'm going to the backbenchers.
Oh, go on then.
And I'm also going to the Tory backbenchers.
Go on.
And my 2022 Politician of the Year is Charles Walker.
Charles Walker, Sir Charles Walker. Go on, tell us about him then.
Well, the reason I've always liked Charles Walker because he was one of the first MPs of any party to come out openly and say that he had mental health problems, that he'd struggled all his life with OCD. But I think the reason he's impressed me this year, in a pretty unimpressive parliament, it has to be said, is he has genuinely, this is a guy who's never been a minister. He's been an MP for 20 odd years. He's never been a minister. But he has genuinely spoken truth to power with real passion and conviction. He did it to Johnson when Johnson was falling apart. He was one of the first people to call on Truss to go, said she was an absolute disgrace and a shambles, that he couldn't imagine why anybody would vote for her. And I remember as well when, during the COVID period, when he seemed to me, you had all these kind of anti-vaxxers who were really, really irritating, but he just had a passionate kind of view that we were doing massive mental health damage by locking people up for so long. We weren't thinking through the consequences. So I'm going for Charles Walker.
Well, that's great. So I always liked him very much. I mean, he's incredible. So he's the stepson of an MP. He's sort of the kind of guy who I thought would be almost a kind of pin-up Conservative MP of the 1950s. He's very kind of good-looking. Very charming, but as you say, has very much been a professional backbencher. He was a big stalwart of the 1922 committee, which was the backbench kind of engine room of the Conservative Party. He could be very funny in the House of Commons. He'd make these incredible... I once saw him make a speech that I think was about 4 words long.
If not now, when?
Oh, very good. Oh, goodness gracious me. Well, there we are. You actually knew that.
That was during... Mind you, that was him calling for a referendum, so I didn't like him for that.
No, although I noticed in the New European, which we sometimes promote a little bit on the show, he gave an interview in 2019 saying, Brexiteer MP : I was an idiot to ever think a referendum was a good idea.
I like him even better.
So one of the nice things is he's quite good, unlike most MPs, at sort of contradicting himself. He says, I'm an idiot. I'm happy to admit to your listeners I'm an idiot.
So there we are. That's the first award. Outstanding UK politicians are Charles Walker from me and Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak from Rory. Now, Outstanding Overseas Politician of the Year, and I guess this one's just really boring, isn't it? Because there's one such an obvious choice currently in Washington.
I know, but we've got to avoid him. We're not allowed to say Zelensky if that's where we're going.
I think we should probably say Zelensky. But here's a great question from Alex Skitt. Outside of Zelensky and Putin, if you could pick one hero and one villain of 2022, who would it be and why? And I think I'm going to go for Joe Biden. I think Joe Biden has just been extraordinary this year. I mean, yes, he's very old, and yes, he looks a bit doddery at times, and he gets his words all muddled up. But I think, we've seen it just in recent days with Zelensky in Washington. For all that Johnson tried to take the credit on Ukraine, Biden has really showed incredible global leadership on Ukraine. He's done some pretty remarkable things on the domestic front, and he's just a very, very nice bloke.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, I'm in the US at the moment, and the last acts of this Democratic Party-dominated Senate and Congress is going to be to vote through another very, very large package of support for Ukraine. But there's an extraordinary dissonance because you're absolutely right. Objectively, he's got through this big stimulus package, one of the biggest environment climate packages ever passed in the United States, probably the biggest. He's done very well in Ukraine. But on the other hand, everybody that I talk to in Washington who works closely with him literally says it's like the end of the film of El Cid. He's like this dead corpse being put on a horse and ridden out. So there's this sort of weird discrepancy between the sense of him being very apparently in public decrepit and forgetful, while at the same time getting these amazing things done. I'd like a shout out though to your friend Macron. I know he embarrassed himself a little bit, I thought, on the World Cup pitch. There we are, I got World Cup reference in.
You're obsessed, or you're obsessed.
He did succeed in seeing off Le Pen in the elections.
Yeah.
We obviously had a major criticism last week of him, which is the way in which he's got in the way of blocking a lot of the accession of countries like Kosovo, Bosnia, Serbia to the EU, which was a very important part of what was drawing people into peace in the Balkans. But all that aside, I think he is a genuinely extraordinary figure. I mean, it's incredible how he's reinvented French politics, how he's shown that being an independent could work, how he reshaped the entire party system. I mean, I think if great politicians are creative people who create new circumstances, Macron certainly seems to have done that.
And so if we're not allowed Putin as the worst foreign politician of the year, I think we probably agreed that he is, but if we're not allowed him, I think I'm going to go for Lukashenko, his poodle, in Belarus. In fact, one of the more interesting things I did this year, was the contact I had with the Belarus opposition, who are some pretty, fantastic people who are doing some very, very brave things. And in fact, you mentioned the New European. Let's give them another plug. They did a big piece. We got the opposition to do a big piece, and it was all about Putin's poodle and so forth. But Lukashenko is one of the few last standing enablers. I guess Xi is to some extent, in that Xi could, he could push harder against him. But I'm going for Lukashenko as Putin's sidekick.
In 2003, when I just finished in Iraq. 2005, just finished in Iraq, and I was looking for a new job in the Foreign Office. And somebody tried to encourage me to apply to be the ambassador in Belarus and said, it's a great opportunity, 2005. Lukashenko's on his way out. This is the last dictatorship on the edge of the European Union. You need to get in there as the ambassador in 2005, and you'll have an amazing 3 years bringing Belarus into the fold of the European Union and spreading democracy to the edge of Russia.
We're not tempted.
Well, here we are, 17 years later. I might have
that would have been a good job. You don't know. You might have made a difference. So what about domestic worst politician of the year? I suppose Johnson and Truss are runaway winners.
Well, I must say Liz Truss was pretty astonishing. I mean, Boris Johnson, as I keep saying, is the most monstrous human being, but has a certain kind of political skill. I mean, he won elections. He almost got himself back in again, voted in by the Conservative MPs. He's standing against great survivor. Liz Truss, I mean, I cannot think of a more catastrophic period, sadly, as Prime Minister for 200 or 300 years. I mean, it broke records in every way, as well as breaking the British economy. On the international side, though, a little shout out for Pedro Castillo, who, although he lasted a bit longer than Liz Truss, is a pretty astonishing combination of both being a pretty uninspiring, this is the president of Peru, ex-president of Peru, pretty uninspiring individual, not great intellectual skills and development, but also managed to culminate in trying to do a massive anti-constitutional coup d'etat, full-on populism, trying to dissolve his own legislature, and has ended up, as you pointed out last week, in jail.
Yeah, but you say he's not inspiring, but he is partly inspiring from jail, these people to go out and fight on the streets, and it's leading to rather a lot of bloodshed.
That's true. That's true. I mean, he's a full-on left-wing populist. I mean, I think he's, and I was thinking about this also with Jeremy Corbyn, who's been popping up a bit on Twitter in the last couple of weeks, holding forth on the World Cup, holding forth on Palestine in the normal Jeremy Corbyn fashion.
Which we all know, holding forth of the World Cup is exclusively your preserve.
Exactly. Jeremy Corbyn and I competing for who is more expert on the subject of football. But it is extraordinary thinking back to 2017 and the fact that he could pack Glastonbury and have the entire crowd chanting "Oh, Jeremy Corbyn." I mean, it is extraordinary, and how somebody who certainly when I entered politics in 2010 was a joke. I mean, I remember the Labour front bench when he spoke would all sort of turn around and laugh, and people would walk out of the chamber when he tried to speak. And
well, I'll tell you, Roy, when on the day that David Cameron won the election against Ed Miliband, and I'd been helping Ed a bit during the campaign, and I was down at Labour Party headquarters, and they asked me to go and do the media round down on College Green. And I was due to do Radio 5 with Peter Allen, Radio 5 Live. And I went over to the tent, and they said, "Oh, Jeremy Corbyn's in there at the moment doing an interview. Would you mind doing it together?" And I said, "Well, I don't mind, but, you better ask him." And so he didn't mind. So we ended up doing this interview together where I was saying that, saying nice things about Ed, but then saying the Labour Party has to regroup and continue to modernise and blah, 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 blah. Now, I honestly think if I had said at that time, "Do you know what? I think the next leader is sitting with us right here in this tent," I think I'd have been taken away and taken over to St Thomas's. And yet, a few weeks later, he was the leader. It was incredible.
It's the most unbelievable story. I don't think it's properly been told. Has somebody written a really good book about how he managed to do this? Because I think if for listeners who are interested in politics, to take it back, this was a man who had never been considered suitable for even the most junior shadow front bench position under any Labour administration, had been put forward as a candidate almost just because it was Buggins's turn for the far left of the Labour Party to rotate through different candidates. And John McDonnell
didn't particularly want to do it.
Didn't want to do it. John McDonnell had done it, I think, the time before, or Diane Abbott done the time before, so they put him through. Got a couple of votes from more moderate figures who thought it was good for diversity to have Jeremy Corbyn in the race.
Margaret Beckett, Sadiq Khan, where are you now?
Exactly. And then next thing we know, he wins. So can you just tell us a little bit about how on earth did he manage to win from a position where nobody rated him to actually winning the whole thing?
I think it was an underestimation of the extent to which the party had changed. And, the party that we'd had it in this era of pretty tight command and control, message discipline, so forth. Then I think going through the crash, because the Labour Party did sort of at least come together behind Ed and really try to go for it, Ed, I think, opened the door to the sense that we needed something a bit more radical. There is, by the way, a good book, and I've just remembered the name of it. It's called It's Left Out, Patrick Maguire and Gabriel Pogrund, who now writes some pretty good stuff for the Sunday Times. Look, it's very hard to explain, but I think also don't underestimate. We're back to this thing about, and I'm not saying this as being critical of Corbyn, we were well into the populist era by then. And I think the sense of somebody going out and basically saying, look, you can have all this stuff that you want. We can make all this massive change, and we can do it without, worrying too much about the detail. He was able, in a way that I never thought he would be able to galvanize an awful lot of young people to say, yeah, I want to get behind this.
It's amazing, isn't it? Because the candidates against him were Yvette Cooper, Andy Burnham, who's been doing an amazing job in Manchester. I really, I grumble about Sadiq Khan, but I'm a great admirer of Andy Burnham's, and Liz Kendall. And you would have thought any one of those three would have been a very, very plausible candidate.
I can't even remember who I voted for.
He apparently won by the largest mandate ever won by a party leader.
Yeah.
With almost no support from his own MPs.
Yeah, Owen Smith he challenged him later, didn't he? And I did vote for him. But no, you've got to hand it to Jeremy Corbyn. He's got something. And now there he is, sort of probably thinking about whether he's going to stand as an independent in Islington. And even very high profile figures, the history for independent candidates is not great. I've got one other shout out for the worst politician of the year.
Yep.
Neil Parish.
Oh, Neil Parish, the poor man who was watching tractor porn on his on his iPad.
I mean, this is, you see, we were just sort of talking about, when we were out for a walk earlier, talking about all these things that have happened in 2022 that you've forgotten. I mean, the Johnson era was just one after one ridiculous incident doing damage to our body politic. And I think Neil Parish, that was without doubt the best excuse of misconduct or bad behavior I've ever heard. I was looking at some tractor websites, and for some reason it led me to this pornographic site, and it popped up as I was sitting in the House of Commons.
It's also very sad, isn't it? Because there was a Labour MP who got in trouble when I was early in Parliament. I'm not going to humiliate him by mentioning him, but his excuse was, again, that he'd again been found with some astonishing male pornography on his screen, and he claimed he had no idea why Google had suggested this to him. But of course, there is a reason why Google suggests this stuff, but we don't need to go into algorithms. Okay, right. Moment of the year. What was your moment of the year?
I'm going to stay in Latin America. I think my moment of the year was Bolsonaro losing. And the reason for that is that even though I have no massive connections with Brazil, if you remember the build up to that, there was all this talk about Bolsonaro wouldn't recognize the outcome if he lost, that there was the possibility of the military and the police getting involved against Lula if he won. And actually, I hope, this could be wishful thinking, but it's one of the reasons I am a little bit more optimistic about the state of the world than I was at the start of the year, is Johnson's gone. And funny enough, Johnson's departure didn't fill me with pleasure for some reason. I just felt so sick at the idea he'd ever been there. But Bolsonaro going, I felt, was potentially a really big turning point.
And Trump, apparently so far, pretty much humiliating himself. I mean, not only now absolutely exposed for his illegal activity, but having really failed to move the dial on the midterms and having really embarrassed himself in the last few weeks.
The other politician who nearly got my Foreign Politician of the Year award was Liz Cheney.
Yeah, I wrote down Liz Cheney. I would have talked about Liz Cheney. I'm a huge admirer of Liz Cheney. Obviously, I am a great admirer of former Conservatives who do the right thing and break against their party leaders. But I think Liz Cheney's been very brave. On moment of the year, I think my moment of the year, to be very boring, has to be the invasion of Ukraine, because it was something that changed 75 years of European history. And it's difficult to remember it was just this year that it happened, that it opened the floodgates to challenging the entire global trade system, destroyed global energy security, wrecked our economies, raised the specter of conflict with China, and moved the world, I think, from an age of populism to an age of global conflict. And I wonder, actually, whether that phenomenon you were talking about, which is some of the short-term fading of populism, so Trump humiliating himself, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss going, Bolsonaro going, may not be connected to that maybe the spectre of global conflict, hopefully, unlike the way that it played in the Second World War, where it seemed to reinforce populist nationalism, may in fact be driving in favor of slightly more moderate figures.
And serious politicians.
And more serious politicians, yeah.
Yeah. I've got to say, I mean, Zelensky has without doubt, I mean, he was Time Magazine of the Year. Let's give a third plug to the New European. He's the New European's European of the Year. Fiona was saying this morning when we were watching his speech in Congress, when you think of the stress levels, I mean, I'm used to operating under quite severe stress levels, but the stress levels that he must be operating under are off the charts. And yet he always seems to be able to come across as pretty authentic, pretty energetic, genuinely leading.
It's wonderful. And there was a great tweet out from Dan Snow yesterday, historian, and he was responding to somebody who'd attacked Zelensky, saying this man's an actor. He's turned up in Congress in his combat fatigues. And Dan Snow reminded us that when Winston Churchill went to visit the United States, the early 40s, he turned up in his sort of Blitz boiler suit. And I think it's right. It's completely legitimate for a war leader to show through the clothes they wear that they are leading in a war. And that's what leadership is partly about. They're public figures. It
also helps with not having to put luggage in the hold. Just take hand baggage, which is
very good. And
as we both agreed, is very important, even if they send Air Force One for you.
Exactly. Camouflage fatigues are also incredibly easy to wash in the hotel sink. So I think there's a huge
Rory, just wait one second, because there's somebody at the door who you might want to say hello to.
Oh, yeah, good. It's going to be a footballer. I'm warning you, it's going to be a footballer. It's Lionel Messi is coming to the door. So he's coming in. It's meant to be Lionel Messi, but he hasn't turned up with Messi, and he hasn't turned up with Ronaldo either.
No, I don't think you want to see
no Lionel Messi, no Ronaldo.
No, not yet. It was a florist.
It was the florist. Oh no!
Sorry. But we'll see.
Got really excited about that.
No message.
Okay, so the surprise of the year, apart from the fact that when your doorbell went, it was the florist. my surprise of the year is, I guess, Europe's willingness to stand up to Russia despite the incredible cost to its economies and the incredible threat to its energy supply. That is not something that Vladimir Putin predicted, and I would not have confidently predicted that the German Chancellor would have stood up so strongly, that Europe would have stood up so strongly, that the UK and the US would have stood up so strongly.
And that Sweden and Finland would apply to join NATO.
For which a shout out to Sanna Marin, the amazing Finnish dancing queen, stroke Prime Minister.
My surprise, Rory.
Yes.
I will be absolutely frank about this. My surprise has been the success of this podcast.
That's pretty surprising. I agree.
I mean, if you think about it, it is only 9 months, 10 months since the Goalhanger team met me in the Pret-a-Manger where you used to do prison pay negotiations and said, did I think a podcast with Dominic Cummings would work? And I said, no, I don't think it would. Not for more than one episode. And then we got hold of you and here we are, top of the charts and flogging out the Albert Hall.
It's very weird, isn't it? It's like
I have found that genuinely surprising.
I think it's surprising. And it's surprising because I'm also it's obviously some kind of odd couple dynamic, but I'm still struggling to pin down exactly how the odd couple dynamic works. But I'm very, very pleased that people want to listen to us. So please keep listening.
So there's a question there, Roy. The question,
Yeah.
Cecily Spelling, what did you hope to achieve with the podcast this year, besides lots of listeners, and what ambitions do you have for next year? I think we have managed to, in fact, I've written about this in the book I've written that's coming out later next year, where I do think you have slightly changed the manner in which I approach politics. And that's through us having this sort of motto of disagreeing agreeably. I can still be very combative. I can still lose my temper. I can still get very vituperative. But I've realized that actually it is better to have a more consensual approach to some of these issues.
Yeah, I think you've also been very good for me. I mean, I definitely have a tendency to go off on slightly pompous, abstract digressions. I think you've been very good at rooting us. I think this is a good tense dynamic. Anyway, we stop congratulating ourselves. What's your book of the year? We've
got one fiction, one non-fiction. My non-fiction book, and I think I read it this year, but I could be wrong. But it's partly what inspired me to write the book that I'm writing, and it is our old friend Moises Naim, The Revenge of Power. I think it's the best encapsulation of a lot of the stuff that we talk about why our politics has gone as bad as it has.
Very good.
My fiction book is, and I'm going to show off my German here. I have read it in German, but it is available in English. And I didn't realize until I picked it up in a German airport that it's been out for a decade. And in German, it's Er ist wieder da. And the English translation is Look Who's Back by Timur Vermes. And it's this incredible book. And it's very funny in parts. And you feel a bit guilty about it being so funny because it's basically about Hitler. And, we shouldn't really laugh about Hitler.
Isn't there an amazing TV series on it?
There's been a film. Yeah, a film.
Yeah.
Which is also called Er ist wieder da. And so basically, just to give you the sort of brief of the story, Hitler wakes up in a rubbish lot near the bunker, and he's got no memory or no knowledge of anything that's happened between 1945 and the Merkel era, which is when he arrives. And essentially, so he goes around the place. Everybody recognizes who he is, but nobody believes him when he says he's Adolf Hitler. They think he's a comedian or he's an actor, and he eventually ends up on a TV show. And there are some incredibly funny bits. The bit where he's trying to get an email address. Somebody's explaining to him about the internet and the email and so on. And he can't understand why he's not allowed just to call himself Adolf Hitler. And there's two reasons. One is that Adolf Hitler is a sort of a very bad name, but also people have stolen every Adolf Hitler formulation going. So it's a kind of satire, but it does give you a sense of why people found him attractive as well, which I know you could argue is a bit dangerous. But anyway, so that's my novel of the year.
That's good. Well, my books here, one of them, very old classic if anyone's got teenage children, but also actually I think it's a great book for adults to read, although it is to some extent a young adult book, Ursula Le Guin, The Wizard of Earthsea trilogy. Very, very strongly recommended. She was an amazing child of an anthropologist, profound thinker from California, wrote very well about the Tao Te Ching, the Chinese mystical text, but produced this wonderful, probably the best book ever written about wizards and dragons.
So, sorry, this is non-fiction?
This is the fiction one.
Oh, this is the fiction one.
Fiction
sorry.
one.
I thought you were talking about. I wondered whether you were going to tell me you also believe in UFOs.
I also believe in dragons. Yeah. A non-fiction one I was going to suggest is by Raphael Baer, and who we almost lost him. He's younger than me and had a terrible heart attack and almost died on a jog. But anyway, he came back from it and has written a book with the title Politics, A Survivor's Guide, which I've read the proof of, and you can pre-order it now.
Oh, it's not out yet?
Not out yet, but it is. Pre-order it, and it's a really, really thoughtful, interesting romp through his own history as a Jewish immigrant, his trips to Eastern Europe, his reporting in Moscow, and then his returning back to what he calls the perma-crisis of Boris Johnson. So Raphael Baer, Politics, The Survivor's Guide.
It sounds like you're promoting what might be a little bit of a competitor to my book, Roy, and so I may have to take him down at some point.
He's gloomier than you. You're the more optimistic one.
Film of the year.
Ooh, film of the year. Yeah, well, I'm going to say Elvis, which you recommended to me, and I thought was absolutely wonderful. Over to you.
I would say Elvis because I love saying Elvis, but I'm going to go for Belfast, Kenneth Branagh. I absolutely loved that film. I think it was this year. I certainly saw it this year. It really is a beautiful film. The young boy who plays what you imagine to be a young Branagh is just so kind of warm and sort of lovable, and the parents have there's a real sense of authenticity about them and about their story, and it's not self-indulgent. You get a real sense of what growing up during the Troubles was like. And it also did, I think I said at the time, it sort of fueled my anger at what this government is doing in continuing to mess around with the peace process by not gripping Brexit in the way that they should.
I've been watching Kenneth Branagh because the Hamlet that I've been watching is Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet. It's full length, 3.5 hours, and he's managed to persuade Charlton Heston to play the actor who does the play within the play. In Hamlet. So that you're
having some right old cultural experiences.
Right old cultural experiences. Right. I think time for a cultural break. So welcome back to the Rest Is Politics Awards ceremony with me, Rory Stewart.
No, Rory, that wasn't good enough. So welcome back to the Rest Is Politics 2022 Awards ceremony.
With me, Rory Stewart.
And me, Alastair Campbell.
The only person I've ever heard do that was Theresa May when she made me a minister, did that sort of voice. It sounded a bit like being made a minister by Paul Daniels. She was like, Rory, I would like to make you the Minister of State in the Department of International Development, like that.
Listen, I heard a hilarious story about one of your appointments the other day. You can tell me whether this is true. I met a guy who is now a press officer at the Labour Party, and he was a press officer at the Prisons Department. And he said that when you were Prisons Minister, you were so sort of committed to your role as Prisons Minister that you were trying out a new tag for prisoners. And they knew that you were about to be appointed to the cabinet by Theresa May because you were wearing your tag.
Exactly. I was wearing an electronic tag, and they were able to monitor me right the way across the road into Downing Street on my electronic tag. And then, of course, as you know, when you get made a minister in a new department, so I'd be made Secretary of State for International Development, I then jumped in this fancy electric Jaguar and was driven over to the Department for International Development.
With your tag?
Still with my tag on. And of course, tags are designed for released prisoners not to be able to remove the tag. And the only way of getting the tag off was back in the Ministry of Justice. But I was now well into my working day in the Department for International Development. So I spent my first 2 days in the job with a tag on.
So I'm glad that was true. That proves that Labour Party press officers always tell the truth.
Oh, always. Yeah. What's your personal highlight of the year, Alastair?
It's a toss-up. They both involve swimming. The one country, I think I only went to one new country this year, and that was Côte d'Ivoire.
Which you loved.
Which
you
I
enjoyed
really,
that, yeah.
really loved. And one of the swims I had there in these incredible waves with these guys who were playing music on the beach, and it was just absolutely beautiful. So that one, but probably the winner was actually last week when I set a new personal low of swimming in 1 degree water.
Ow.
So I think that was my personal highlight.
So, but just sort of quick, 1 degree, there is ice on it or there isn't ice on it? Not quite.
You can see the beginnings of ice.
You can see the beginnings,
yeah.
So my highlight of the year, cheesily, is actually taking over as the president of Give Directly and re-engaging with poverty in Africa, because after I left politics, I went into a bit of a hibernation. I taught at Yale. I was a bit out of the swing of things, and it's been amazing to now be back in a proper job and to be able to travel properly in Africa and to take on a new team. We've got nearly 1,000 people, 12 country offices. But most of all, I think we do have a crack at making a dent in extreme poverty in our lifetime. And I think cash transfer and the dignity it gives to people, the trust it gives to people, very exciting, which is why I'm very keen, Alastair, to invite you to come on a trip maybe with the pod to Malawi next year. Absolutely, definitely.
That'd be great fun and interesting as well. Now, what about speech of the year?
Ooh, speech of the year. I'm not really a big. Actually, it's a bit last year, but I often don't give him full credit. But probably the best parliamentary speech I heard was Tom Tugendhat on the Afghan withdrawal, which was the most extraordinary 5-6 minutes of passion, anger, glimpses of humor, real oratory, and a very serious political point about the shamefulness of Britain's abandonment of Afghanistan. And yeah, I should give him a bit of a shout out on that. Who's your speech of the year?
Well, I'm going to get a bit of grief here from all my Labour friends, because my runner-up is Michael Heseltine, who did a brilliant speech about why we should never give up the fight to get back into the European Union. But my winner is a speech that John Major made, and the headline of the speech was "In Democracy We Trust?" ? And it was one of, in a very Major-esque, quite understated sort of way, it was the finest demolition of Johnson and the damage that he was doing to democracy. And I strongly recommend that people look it up and read the whole thing, just to be reminded, because there's a real danger we forget of the sort of slow erosion of standards and the long-term damage.
I also owe you something, because it's thanks to you that I've had another look at Tony Blair, who I was deeply, deeply skeptical of. And I was actually very impressed. I went to an event that he organized, very impressed by his speech and his engagement with technology, his thoughtfulness about the future of work. I think your doorbell's going, though. Is this Lionel Messi turning up to see you again?
Let me go see if Messi's arrived. It might be Ronaldo. I don't know. Hold on.
So we're waiting for Alastair to return. I'm looking at his bookshelf. And I'm looking at a door. There's some strange guest coming in.
This person has even brought me a nice Christmas present.
Oh, beautiful! Brought you a present. But who is this? Because you're in the way of the camera, I can't see the person.
You'll have to put an earphone.
You're not seriously in action, are you? Is this being filmed?
It's David Miliband leaning at Alastair's feet. It's absolutely extraordinary. David, hello.
David Miliband is playing Santa. I brought Alastair his Christmas. Alastair and Fiona, but it's slightly Alastair focused. 2 Christmas presents.
Oh, David, we're very, very excited to have you. And he talks you up a lot, so I wasn't quite sure whether you were going to be one of the most famous footballers in the world or
I said
whatever.
Lionel Messi was coming.
Oh my God, I feel like I've disappointed you. As always, I've been a disappointment. This is making me feel like I'm very close to kissing you. Can you put this in the other ear?
I put my ear like that, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Actually, Alastair and I were being photographed. We got very close to kissing each other. We were made to be photographed almost nose to nose.
What, at the Royal Albert Hall in front of 5,500 people?
Yeah, it was very disturbing. David, quick question for you. We're doing our events of the year. And somebody called Emily O'Brien's written it, and I'm going to give you a second because it's not unfair to you. I'm going to get Alastair to answer first. Mistake of the year in politics and personally. We'll give you a bit of time. I'm going to let Alastair think about it while you think about mistake of the year.
Do you mean being our own mistakes or other people's
mistakes? Well, no, I
think
a mistake, someone else's mistake in politics.
Truss Kwarteng, without a doubt.
That was pretty colossal, wasn't it?
That's the second award for Truss and Kwarteng.
In the demerits of the year.
Yeah. Go on then.
I think the mistake of the year was Putin's invasion of Ukraine. This was a bad year for dictators in various ways. It was a very bad year for people around the world in extreme circumstances. But I think Putin's invasion will go down as grand historical error on Napoleonic scale.
I think David Miliband's mistake of the year is kneeling down at my
I'm not at your feet. I'm at exactly. I've got this rather difficult thing, but I want you to open the present because the trees motif has got.
He's opening a present, just for those of you who are listening to this.
Oh,
you can listen
I
to the
see.
cricket.
Look.
What's he giving you?
How to be more tree.
Now, just look at
that's...
it. Don't do what children do and throw the present away before you've looked at it.
Great Trees of New York map.
Oh, was he expecting a Pokemon or something, and now he's really disappointed?
But look at the thing is, it tells you how this now. I'm afraid, just in case you are suffering from low self-esteem, this will show that actually your obsession with trees is quite well grounded. Look at what the chapter
essential life lessons for perennial happiness. I've always believed trees can make you happy.
No, that the trees don't. The trees have figured out how to be happy. Look at the chapter headings.
Okay. Beginnings are always small.
Japanese maple tree.
Patience is a virtue. I've heard that one.
Draw strength from others. Aspen tree.
Where'd you get with the patience as a virtue one, Alastair?
Ask for help when you need it. The elm tree does that.
Ah, that's very good.
Adapt to your environment.
The American
beach. Be authentic. Hornbeam. Always have a plan B. What's your plan B, David?
I'm on to plan N by now, I think, rather than plan B.
Thank you very much.
Are you podcasting in the questions podcast? Or
no, we're doing the awards. We're doing a special award.
Awards ceremony.
How many have you won for yourself?
I haven't won any. Well, the podcast was the success of the podcast was the surprise.
David, I want you to have a chance to talk properly to Alastair, but can we just quickly do the last bits on this pod?
No, David's not staying. He's going.
I'm not. Well, he's got very important people to see.
Well, let's do event of the year sport, event of the year culture, and then let you have 5 minutes chat to David. So, Gunn, what's your event of the year sport? What's your event of the year?
The event
cultural?
of the year in sport. Well, you'd have to say the World Cup. I think, but the English cricket has been amazing this year. Amazing, just extraordinary.
I have to say, I think Burnley absolutely destroying Blackburn Rovers was up there. I do think Ben Stokes should have been Sports Personality of the Year. I know it was fantastic that the women won the football, and Beth Mead is a great footballer, but what Ben Stokes has done this year has been extraordinary. My cultural event of the year is ABBA Voyage.
Oh yeah,
and if you haven't seen it, go and see it. But it also has a political connotation, this, because it did make me worry about the potential for deep fake.
Because you really thought you were watching ABBA, even though you were sitting next to ABBA.
You were watching the 4 members of ABBA perform live. It was incredible.
Despite the fact they were sitting next to you. So my culture event of the year, just a reminder of all the things that have happened this year, is the Queen's funeral. It's extraordinary that this year has seen so much. The Boris Johnson Liz Truss car crashes, Donald Trump temporarily imploding, Putin's invasion of Ukraine, but the Queen's funeral. The death of the Queen, I think, has been a massive epochal event for Britain.
Perhaps also worth mentioning as a great cultural event, the Liz Truss curtsy. Perhaps we should just abolish the whole curtsy thing, Rory. What do you think? I think the curtsy thing.
Does Rory curtsy to you when he comes into the podcast?
I don't think he curtsies to me, but I suspect he does curtsy when he meets Camilla.
Well, at the moment, I noticed David's actually kneeling to you, which I've never actually done yet.
You wouldn't notice that. You can't see me below my midriff or above my chin, below my chin.
I think we should let David stay because the other thing we're doing is a Lifetime Achievement Award. Ooh. Okay. Now, we've already decided who this is because it's the only one we had to agree on. Mm-hmm. And we've agreed that the first ever Rest Is Politics Lifetime Achievement Award goes to Neil and Glenys Kinnock.
Wow, that's very nice.
Neil, because of his role in paving the way.
And Glenys, who's had a great public career, but also has been struggling a little bit with dementia.
Yeah, about which they're now talking openly as a way of trying to raise awareness and better services, etc. Of course, Glenys worked for you at the Foreign Office.
Glenys was a minister in the Foreign Office. Very lucky for me. She was extraordinarily committed. She had this real experience from the European Parliament and the work she'd done in Africa. Neil was actually the chairman of the British Council when we appointed Glenys as the minister, and he then felt he had to resign from the British Council to avoid any suggestion
reminds you. Can you imagine any of this?
I mean, honestly, it hadn't really occurred to anyone that there was a reason for him to resign. There was no reason for him to resign, but he immediately said, "I think it's fantastic that Glenys is being made a minister." She was briefly minister for Europe and then became minister for Africa. But he said, I can't carry on in this role because you know what it'll be like. People will say that something will come up and people will say that it wasn't right. So he resigned, and he'd done an amazing job. He'd been 4 or 5 years as the chairman of the British Council.
Oh, well, I think it's a very good thing to end on. And we're going to let Alastair and David chat for a few minutes. And thank you all so much for listening to the Rest Is Politics special events.
No, Rory, you've got to do better than that. Thank you so much for joining us at the Rest Is Politics Awards for 2022. See you next year. That's how you do it.
See you next year.